It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mary Beth Norton, the Mary Donlin Alger Professor of American History Emerita. Mary Beth graduated from the University of Michigan and received an MA and PhD from Harvard University. She taught for 2 years at the University of Connecticut before coming to Cornell as an assistant professor in 1971, the first woman ever hired or even interviewed by the Cornell History Department. 1971. Oops. Yeah, Cornell has a great history of women students, faculty, not so much. That's probably a whole different talk. She would spend 47 years at Cornell until her retirement in 2018. In her time at Cornell, she served 2 terms as faculty trustee and published 6 monographs on early American history, including 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, which won the George Washington Prize for Best Book on the Revolution, published in 2020. She's won numerous other awards, and this past May, at the Harvard commencement, she was awarded a Centennial Medal by the Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, primarily for her role as a pioneer in the field of early American women's history, as epitomized by her groundbreaking Liberty's Daughters, the Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800, first published in 1980 and still in print. Liberty's Daughters was most recently cited as a landmark book in the November 2025 issue of the Atlantic magazine. Mary Beth will introduce and discuss the anonymous letters requesting personal advice from a group of self-described experts that appeared in the Athenian Mercury, a twice-weekly inexpensive broadsheet published in London from 1691 to 1697. I was delighted to learn that you can see the original in the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections, as well as online versions through the library. In this interactive presentation, she will be assisted by 3 other members of CAPE: Tim Mount, Professor Emeritus of Applied Economics and Management; Jane Powers, Retired Director of Act for Youth; and Joe Thomas, Ann and Elmer Linseth, Dean Emeritus and Professor of Operations Management Emeritus, who will read and respond to some of the letters that she selected, edited, and modernized for publication in her newly published book, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer. I recently read the book, which I would highly recommend, and I'm looking forward to learning more. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Elaine, for that really nice introduction. I should say the title of the book is a quote from one of the letters. You will see similar comments in some of the letters that are written, similar words, but this particular phrase was picked by my editor at Princeton University Press, who was wonderful to work with on this book. So we start with the image of a coffee house. Now, why start with a coffee house? The Athenian Mercury, the publication we're talking about this morning, was aimed originally at the male patrons of these coffee houses. As you can see from this image, the only woman in the room is the female worker in the back who is managing the coffee pots, who are on her right on the fire. And she helps serve the coffee, but that's it. So we're talking about a publication that originally was aimed only at men. Now, the publication was begun by a man named John Dunton, who was a very entrepreneurial printer in England at the time. And he tells the story in his autobiography that he was walking in a park one day with a friend when it suddenly struck him that he should start this particular project, which he called the Question Project. His idea was to have a publication, a broadsheet publication that would simply be questions and answers. People, in other words, the patrons of the coffee houses, would ask questions and they would be responded to by a team of experts. Now, the team of experts happened to be Dunton and his two brothers-in-law, but nobody knew that in the beginning. And you'll see later on an image of what they thought it was like. Coffee houses at the time were famous for what you can see the men here doing. They're smoking, they're reading, they're chatting, and in one case, they're fighting. And this is, coffee houses at the time are known for this. Now, Dunton, in his autobiography, doesn't say that he just left a coffee house when he was walking in the park, but I think he probably had. He'd just come out of this environment, and he'd been in a place where men were having wide-ranging discussions, and topics came up that people couldn't know the answer to or didn't know the answer to. It's the kind of thing that would happen today when we would all pull out our phones and look at our little computers from our pockets to tell us to give us the answer to a discussion or a problem that had come up. Of course, that was not available to men in the 17th century. So what I say about this is it's really Google for the 17th century. He was inventing a search engine because the idea behind the publication is that the questions will be asked, they will be answered very quickly in a broadsheet publication that will come out the next week. He and his friends, his brothers-in-law, they planned for one broadsheet a week. Quickly, it went viral, we could say, in modern terms. And so they had to move to two issues a week to make it work. And even then, they had huge piles of questions that were pouring in. The other thing I think often happened in these conversations was that it wasn't just that people didn't know the answers to something that came up, but they didn't want to reveal their ignorance about something to their friends. So the whole point of this was it was anonymous. You asked the questions anonymously, and you got answers anonymously. Because in the beginning, Dunton concealed his connection to the publication. In fact, the first issues, if you do indeed go to the Rare Book Room and look at what I did, you will see in the early issues, he has a fake name for the publisher at the end of the broadsheets. It's not until some months that he revealed who he was, who was the guy who was behind this project. So I think of this as one possibility would be someone who would ask a question would be someone who didn't know the answer. If the problem was, does the Earth go around the sun or does the sun go around the Earth, which is a problem at the time. And if you didn't want to reveal your ignorance, you could simply ask the experts of the Athenian society. And so I want to share with you, oops, I had given you John Dunton anyway. This is John Dunton. This is the frontispiece from his autobiography. There he is looking very bewigged and serious. And this is the image he liked to convey of himself. Alas, by the time he published the autobiography, which was in 1705, he was having financial difficulty. And I'll get to that in a minute, but he was having trouble. And one of the reasons for the autobiography was to try to make some money, and it didn't sell very well. Although it is, they tell me, one of the very first autobiographies written in English. Now, John Dunton had his print shop about where that black dot is. I can tell you that it took a lot of hard work from both me and the production manager at Princeton University Press to figure out where his print shop was. But if you know London at all, even in the past or present, you can see that in the far left corner is the image of the former St. Paul's Cathedral, which was, of course, replaced by the building that we all know so well today. And the poultry, his address was, as it says at the beginning, at the end, at the sign of the Raven in the Poultry. And so the Poultry was this very short street. But the way we found out where this was we found, actually the production manager found a statement that the print shop was opposite that short street you see in the upper, on the other side of the street. And so that's how we figured out where it was. This area was an area full of coffee houses and print shops, and people would have delivered their letters. I should say that the address for delivering a letter to the Athenian Mercury was not the Athenian Mercury, it was a coffee house. And so people would hand deliver the letters that they wanted answered to this coffee house. And then John Dunton and his brothers-in-law, actually the brothers-in-law, they had a contract, and the brothers-in-law would pick up the letters and would then, Dunton would assign them to responding to the letters. The letters were it depended on how long the letters were, depended how long the answers were, but between 12 and 15, 20 letters would be answered in any one issue. And now I want to show you a typical issue. And this is actually an image from the Rare Book Room. I took it here myself. It is what it looked like. It's not very typographically interesting, to put it mildly, but and the other side is basically the same, but with no title, obviously. Now, at first, they had questions which were what they expected. They said in their call for questions, we will answer questions on religion, on science, on history. They did say they wouldn't answer questions about politics. Remember when this was? This was the 1690s in England. Politics was very fraught at the time. And so they tried to stay away from political topics. And indeed, once they did get caught answering a political letter, and the censor stopped the publication for several months. There's an indication in Dunton's autobiography that he had to bribe the censor to be able to publish again. Now, at first, the questions were what they anticipated. That is, there are questions about religion. One of the early questions is, did Adam and Eve eat actual apples? Another question was, who did Cain marry? So there are questions like that they did answer. And one of Dunton's brothers-in-law was a minister, so they were very experienced and capable of answering such questions. But in the 13th issue, which was 6 weeks in, remember there's 2 issues a week, so the middle of the 6th week, a man wrote in with a series of general questions that were personal in nature, not specific to himself, but personal. These questions included things like, who is worse off in a marriage, a man or a woman? Or, don't people today marry too young? Or, don't people today often marry too often marry for money? Those are the kinds of questions that started to come in. And they answered all those questions. There were a whole series of them. I think there were 12 or 13 questions from one guy, and they answered them all. That very same issue, they announced that they have received an inquiry from a lady in the country. That's their phrase, a lady in the country. Now, this would obviously be shocking because they were aiming their publication solely at men who were in London coffee houses. So how did this lady in the country learn about the existence of the Athenian Mercury? But what she did was she wrote in and said, will you answer questions from ladies as well as gentlemen? And so she clearly shocked them by this inquiry, both because she was from the country and because it was a woman. They had never anticipated an audience that included women. And so they said, why, yeah, we'll answer questions from anyone. And so they started then answering other questions, including from women. And the first set of questions, they had from a woman were very similar to that first set of questions they had from a man. And now, whether it was the same woman who wrote in, we don't know, because everything's anonymous. I have no idea. But in any event, a woman wrote in and said things like, "What is true beauty?" That was her kind of question. A kind of question that would interest a woman, perhaps, but not, but very, very general and not specific. But as time passed, more and more truly personal questions started appearing. Are these questions true? Who knows? It's all anonymous. None of the letters of this sort survive in Dunton's papers, which are at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I went to the Bodleian and I looked for letters and correspondence. There is other correspondence there about the Athenian Mercury and about Dunton's publishing career, but none of the letters of this sort that I used in the book are published or are available. And even at the time, there were people who wrote in and said, "You're making it all up." And they said, no, we're only printing what people tell us. Now, of course, the people who wrote in may have been making it up. And indeed, some people wrote in and said, "I'm writing for a friend." And they saw through that right away. And so, in fact, my editor became very confused because some answers would start out, "Well, your friend X," and it would end, "You." And so she said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, in the middle of making the answer, the guys realized or wanted to admit that what we're talking about is the person who's writing in, him or herself, rather than some friend who needed advice." So the letters that I picked for the book are letters on love and marriage and sex, of course. Those are the things that interested me the most. Some of the reviewers of the book said it would have been fun if she'd really dealt with all the letters that they wrote in, and that's true. It's a publication that's important, it turns out, for the history of science, because it tells you something about what people understood about science at the time. But about 30% of the letters overall, and when you look at all the issues over the period that it ran from 1691 to 1697, about 30% of the letters are of a personal nature. Of those, 40% are from men, 25% are from women, and others you can't identify the sex of the person who is writing the letter. So about 70% of the total correspondence to the Athenian Mercury is on other topics, and the ones that the Athenians intended to deal with. Now, where did I get these figures? I did not sit down and count the letters. Someone else did. There is a very excellent book that was published, a scholarly book that was published in the early aughts by a British historian named Helen Berry about gender and the Athenian Mercury. And in fact, it was that book, reading that book years ago, that first clued me in to the existence of these letters and of the Athenian Mercury. And Helen Berry sat down with a randomly selected volume, and I'll tell you in a minute what a volume consisted of, a randomly selected volume, and counted the topics of the letters. And so that's where I got these percentages. The volumes were about 20 issues. About every 20 issues, Dunton would bind them into a volume. That's what we have in the library, is those bound volumes. And in some of them, there exists a very interesting preface that was added to the bound volumes. And I should say, if any of you do try to look this up, on the online versions, you don't ever see the preface. The only place you can see it is in the bound volumes. And so that's why, in fact, the bound volumes at the Cornell Library were so important to me, because I could see the preface, because that's where the Athenians would say things like, "Stop sending letters. We're getting too many questions. Don't send any more until we've answered the backlog that we have." And people, in fact, did complain that they'd written, weeks or months before and hadn't gotten an answer. And you see that in some of the letters. Who are the correspondents? They do seem to be mostly young. Does this mean the readers were mostly young too? I don't know. Are the people who they chose to publish representative of the whole, or are they just things that the Athenians were interested in? How did the Athenians decide what to print? Sometimes they say, and there's one, at least, I think there's 2 letters we're reading this morning, that they say they want to educate others about the problem, and that's why they're printing it. About misbehavior. These are mostly middling people. They're mostly not wealthy, and they're not poor. A lot of them seem to be upwardly mobile. They talk about their lives in that way. They do refer to each other as ladies and gentlemen, but they're not wealthy people. That's just the sort of the convention that they use for referring to each other and the way that the Athenians refer to them. Now, just to give you an idea of the volumes, this is the cover. This is from the Cornell Library. The title pages of the first and second volumes. Now, notice the difference between what the title page of the first volume says and what the title page of the second volume says. The first volume just says we're answering questions from the ingenious. The second one says we're answering questions from the ingenious of either sex. And so this is their public indication that they are, in fact, open to questions from women. And I actually love the contrast between this, but this was one of my debates with Princeton University Press. They didn't want to print both these images. So we only have the second image as an illustration, not the first. Now, the idea of these volumes was they would be hawked to coffee house owners, and these volumes would then sit on the pages, on the tables in the coffee house, so men could peruse them as they are drinking their coffee and having their conversations. And they can look up because the volumes have indexes. And the indexes tell you what the topics of the questions are, and they give you the indication of the date when that was answered. And so if you are sitting in a coffee house and you don't know the answer to something, and you think about it, and you look it up in the index, and you can look up a previous answer. And they do, in fact, say, don't send us questions we've already answered. Please just look up the index, and if we haven't answered the question, then we will answer yours. But we don't want to duplicate ourselves. So, in fact, they ended up duplicating themselves sometimes. But in fact, they did try to cut down on the duplications by telling people to check the indexes. Now, I want to show you, this is an image that I particularly like. I mentioned this briefly a minute ago. This is the emblem of the Athenian society. This is to show, and this is 1692, and it's to give an indication of what the Athenian society supposedly looks like. There are all the bewigged experts sitting on the top row, and they are answering questions from the people below. We have the middling people, maybe a little bit better off people on the second level, holding up their questions with their pieces of paper, and they're asking questions of the Athenians. The lower level shows the more ordinary people. And in particular, I like the woman or the man on the bottom who is being beaten on by a woman. And he says, "Help, help, noble Athenians." The other things about the emblem of the Athenian society are in the upper left and right corners, we have Rome and Athens. In the lower left and right corners, we have people coming in carriages from Oxford and Cambridge. Everyone is coming to consult the Athenian society. And at the bottom, there is a celebratory poem, which, alas, you can't read. It's just too small, but it's really fun. And it starts, I can't recite the first line, but the first line is fun. It's about we who, you will never know who we are, basically, is what the first line says. So in any event, I love this image. It's just great because it shows the whole idea of the Athenians as this great group of experts on every topic who can be consulted by everyone. Now, the selections that I've chosen for this morning are to illustrate the major themes of the questions and answers: courtship behavior, parental consent problems, marriage and the involvement of love and money with marriage, and abusive spouses. And then what my editor cleverly titled as one of the chapters, Dangerous Liaisons. In fact, premarital and extramarital sex and confessions of sexual misbehavior. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the Athenian Mercury is that they gave similar advice to men and women in all the categories, except pretty much difficult marriages where they couldn't give similar advice because women were in big trouble if the marriage was a problem, since there was no divorce and they were really stuck to a man who was misbehaving, and we'll see that in one of the questions and answers this morning. But the Athenians prided themselves on their openness to women. And when some readers write in to say they were ruining their learned reputation by answering personal queries from both men and women, they responded by saying, no, it's important to answer these questions because families are the basis of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, or the families are the basis of society. The society is the basis of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth is the basis of the nation. So they defended themselves, and as I say, they prided themselves on their openness to women, and indeed, for the 1690s, they were, shall we say, less misogynist than most. There's no question about that. And they were often critical of men and their behavior, and you will see this in some of the questions and answers this morning. Now, you may ask, as some people did, is there an American connection to this publication? There is. There is a connection to the American colonies in the 1690s. We need to see the ocean more as a highway than as a divider. John Dunton himself had visited Boston to sell books in the 1680s. He became, in the 1690s, the publisher of Cotton Mather's works on witchcraft. And that's, in fact, how I first encountered John Dunton, was as the publisher of Cotton Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World, one of the most famous books about Salem witchcraft, when I was working on Salem witchcraft. And there are sporadic mentions of America in the Athenian Mercury, but more important was the fact that when Dunton did, in fact, encounter financial difficulties after the Athenian Mercury ceased publication in the late 1690s, he sold the copyright to the material to a man named Andrew Bell. And Andrew Bell put out a 3-volume edition of the letters in 1703, 1704. Those volumes were sold in America, for example, by Benjamin Franklin in 1746 in his print shop. And they were sold at least until the American Revolution. And I can track that thanks to ads that appear in American newspapers that I can access online. And so it's fun to follow the Athenian oracle through the 18th century in America. And I want to show you one thing. This is a clip that I found from a New Hampshire newspaper in 1796 with a quote from Shakespeare and a quote from the Athenian oracle. So people were still reading it. There's actually even, now that I can go further in online indications of the Athenian oracle, references to the Athenian oracle actually come up through the 19th century in peculiar ways. That's always one of two stories that turn up in American newspapers in the 19th century. One is, what's the origin and meaning of barber poles? And the other is Christmas customs in England in the 1690s. And those come up repeatedly in American newspapers in the 19th century. So I just want to say, to close this talk with a brief description of my editorial process. This book is not aimed at historians, but it's rather aimed at readers in general. In fact, some historians have been not happy about some of the things that I did, some of the things I cut out, some of the ways I edited some of the letters. But 17th century prose, if you've ever tried to read it, is convoluted with very long sentences. It's full of double negatives. It's full of unfamiliar words or familiar words that are used in unfamiliar ways. And I wrote, as I did my editing, the OED was a constant companion because I sometimes had to look up what word usage in the 1690s to figure out what people were saying and why and how they were saying it. So I did something I've never done in a historical work before. I modernized the prose, I modernized the punctuation, I modernized the capitalization, I modernized the spelling, I cut sentences from both the questions and the answers. Everybody was very long-winded. I changed negatives to positives. All those double negatives were driving me crazy. So I changed the verbs to positives. They were also one of the reasons why the sentences were so convoluted. My editor decided that we shouldn't, it turned out that she picked this up. I didn't pick it up. A lot of the questions started out with whether, W-H-E-T-H-E-R, whether men should marry or not, something like that. And she said, let's get rid of all those wethers. So we did. So the question then becomes, should men marry or not? You know, we just got rid of the word whether to start the question. So I invite all of you to listen to the problems of people in the past and to ask yourselves, as you hear these letters and the answers, are things different or the same, more or less, as they are today? And that's one of the things that the people who've reviewed the book have been asking themselves. So I'd like to ask my friends from the Cape Executive Council to come up and join me here on the stage. One of them is already here, and I particularly thank my colleagues, Joe Ramos, Jane Powers, and especially Tim Mount, who is sitting here already, who has a broken leg, and it's amazing that he came. And Tim will be reading John Dunton, and Jane will be reading letters from women, and Joe will be reading letters from men. So I'm going to join them over here. Over to John Dunton.
We sometimes see persons love tenderly after marriage who could hardly endure each other's sight before. But as it's proposed here, whether we marry such as we cannot love, the question must be answered in the negative, since such a practice would be the most cruel and imprudent thing in the world. Society is the main end of marriage. Love is the bond of society, and without love, neither pleasure, profit, or honor can be found in marriage. He then, or she, that marry for so base an end as profit without any possibility or prospect of love is guilty of the highest brutality imaginable. As one wittily observes, it is too general a truth to be feared that he who marries a woman he can never love will soon love a woman he never married.
You know why I picked that? I really like that last line. Now, the other general question will be read by Jane. And in this one, a woman asks how to assess men's motives when they're courting. And the Athenians, watch for it, warn of the possible duplicity of men.
I see in some of your former Mercuries that you blame the female sex for being too credulous and wonder why we aren't more careful about whom we believe. Pray, be so kind, skill. When a man courts us, how shall we know whether it's for marriage or for diversion or any other reason?
So difficult a question that we believe many a man can scarce resolve it himself in the time of his courtship. Like other common swearers and liars, he might have told this tale so often that he believes it himself. There are indeed so many equivocations in love that it's much easier to be in the wrong than in the right. We must therefore return to our old infallible rule. If a man does really marry you, you may believe he courted you for marriage at least, if not for love. But woe be to you if you believe him upon his word and honor, faith, and conscience. A parcel of strong words in the matrimonial service will have and hold him to the grindstone, when all other lies are as easily broken as made. It's 10 to 1 that he forsakes you, laughs at you, and exposes you into the bargain.
And that's the kind of comment that they frequently make when people ask, is it really important to get married? Or can't we just live together and promise that we'll be faithful? And they say, watch out in a situation like that. Now, next we have two questions involving young people's conflicts with their parents about courtship. The first comes from a man, and note the use of the word friends here. Here's one of the ones that's different in the 17th century from today. He means parents and relatives, as well as what we would refer to as friends. And this is this is standard. This is not a word that I ever changed. I kept friends throughout, and I explained it in the introduction. Also, pay attention to the comment that he has favoring the parent's opinion.
I love a young lady so much that, though I frequent the park and the playhouse, I cannot meet there anyone whom I can find nearly as handsome. Her charms have absolutely possessed my heart. I cannot begin to love another, but my friends won't let me marry her. What shall I do to divert myself and make the time seem shorter till I can marry her? I would join the army, but my relations deny me that also. If you will, gentlemen, instruct me by a speedy answer.
Poor man, will no new face cure you? If you are willing to follow the wise advice of your friends, for they know the world better than you, and will endeavor to disengage yourself from the young lady, travel, if that is permitted by your relations. Otherwise, observe all curiosities you meet with, but if your affairs won't permit that, study at first history, which is diverting, and then follow as your interests direct you. By all means, avoid idleness and the sight of the lady or anything that remind you of her. Find some agreeable, ingenious acquaintances who have conquered Cupid and know how to value their freedom. If you follow this method, a little time will infallibly recover you.
So I'll just comment that that's the kind of advice that they offer to others, that is, find diversions to, so you won't keep your mind on your beloved and the fact that you can't marry him or her. This advice goes to both men and women. So next, though, there is the advice to a daughter that appears different.
I am a young woman that has been very dutiful to my parents, but now they have proposed a match for me whom I cannot love. Therefore, I humbly desire your advice. How shall I discharge my duty? Shall I oblige my parents and live an uncomfortable life, or disoblige them by refusing what they so earnestly importune me to. This is a real matter of fact. Therefore, I desire your speedy answer.
As a child can't lawfully dispose of itself without the consent of its parents, so on the other side, we don't understand that the parents can marry their children without their consent. We think the many unhappy examples of such matches should prevail with parents. We think children that are not dutiful if they deny their compliance.
So the thing that's interesting here is that they're laying out what becomes their standard response if there's a dispute between parents and child about who the child should marry. They stuck to this formula in their other answers. If the young person could not marry without the parents' approval, but the parents couldn't force a marriage on a son or daughter. So what would be the result? What would happen? And they said possibly just delay the idea of marriage until your parents die, and then you can marry who you want. Now, next we have a question from an ardent young man about his courtship behavior. And this letter is one of my favorites, and it's frankly is one that has been a favorite of reviewers of the book.
Gentleman is interrupting discourse by repeated kisses and rude and unmannerly, and more apt to create aversion than love.
Not so hasty, good sir. You have made great progress indeed in your amour. The truth is, kissing is a luscious diet. He must therefore remember to feed cautiously, as if he were eating melons. Moderation verily is an excellent thing which he must observe, and kiss as well as talk with discretion.
Now, the next is a question from an older, and I put that in quotation marks, asking advice on the choice of a spouse. This letter is interesting not only because of her characterization of her own position, but also because it's more specific than usual about the possible choices she faces.
I am an old maid, 30 years of age. This is a state I always dreaded, and I cannot tell why fortune should be more unkind to me than she has been to the rest of my relations. I have only attracted a tailor, a weaver, and a journeyman shoemaker. I have a great aversion to all those trades. Even so, I would not have refused them all except for my greater love for a barber who used to honor me with his company a little now and then. But now that he recognizes that I am in love with him, he has stopped visiting me. He also avoids my company at all places where I go in hopes of seeing him. Now, gentlemen, my request is that you would please advise me what I should do about him. Otherwise, I must be forced to choose someone in one of the aforementioned trades, or at least the first that comes to me. Neither am I someone to avoid having two trades, viz. The art of japanning and periwig making. In addition, I have 30 or 40 pounds in ready money and a lottery ticket.
Marry as fast as you can. Repent and then grow wiser.
If people don't know what the trade of japanning is, it is the creating, how do I describe it? Illustrated surfaces on trays and things like that for like a tea trade or something, a tea tray. And so she is a skilled, she's saying she has her own skills, and she's a very, attractive despite her age. She is a very attractive potential spouse, but I especially like the lottery ticket part of her. question. Now, tobacco and coffee were both recent fads at this time, and they turn up in some questions. And this one we're reading is perhaps a comic relief. Maybe this is a joke. There are joke letters occasionally, and the Athenians recognize there are jokes, and they make jokes in response. It's not entirely clear to me whether this is a joke, but in any event, it's fun, and it is about coffee.
I'm now courting a young lady who is very agreeable, her fortune and quality being equal to my birth and estate. But the problem is that she drinks an insufferable amount of coffee, which I think is the reason for her coyness and aversion to my courtship. She has an aversion for me, and therefore I hope some way may be found to make her less cruel. I beg your advice in this matter.
It is not likely we can persuade the lady not to drink the Stygian liquor if you yourself have no power over her. We know only two ways. Either get some of her friends to tell her the dangerous effects of coffee in both sexes, that it will make her look old, spoil her teeth and the like, or if that does not work, drink excessive amounts of coffee yourself in front of her until you have topped her consumption. Resolve to drink it as long as she does. Then possibly she will be influenced by her pity for your circumstances and fear that such intemperance will injure you, bringing on some paralytical distemper. This is especially true if she intends to marry you, for she won't want to set you so poor an example.
Okay, next we have 3 questions about pre- or extramarital sex. One from a woman who regrets having been seduced, and 2 from men seeking to extricate themselves from sexual relationships they no longer want.
An impoverished gentleman on whom nature has lavished her stock to render him an unresisted instrument of melting the breasts of the softer sex has allured that gift from me, which is only due to a husband, and would willingly marry me. But my fortune being inconsiderable, I fear I should render myself despicable and irretrievably poor. My friends have introduced a gentleman of an inviting estate, whose person I could like, had I not first seen my handsome deceiver. I am racked with confusion, what resolution I shall take herein, and since my poor judgment is weak and imperfect, as is common to my sex, I entreat you would speedily impart your friendly advice.
First, repent. Then either remain unmarried or marry him that has been so well acquainted with you, for you cannot justly marry any other. We had not printed this, but that others might take warning by your example.
Now, I found this exchange particularly interesting for 2 reasons. It's the only letter that I found in which a woman alludes to her poor judgment as a woman, and the answer, like others, states that they are printing the letter to warn others. This is typical in the statement that she should only marry the man she originally had sex with, or she should remain single. This is a common way they deal with such letters. So, over to another man.
I have long lived in an unlawful, though successful, amour. I have enjoyed all the favors that a lovely young woman can bestow. I am very sensible of the sin I commit, as well as the injury I do the husband. I therefore beg your advice what I shall do to avoid the lovely tempter, who will not fail to press me in a continuance of our passion, which I am resolved to quit.
In answer, we first hope the gentleman is in earnest and that he needs no more arguments to convince him of the absolute necessity there is of leaving this damnable sin. He asks what measures shall he take to avoid her, but we will go further, as we suppose the querist desires, and direct him how to break off entirely. This we advise him to do, not to do personally, but by letter, in which he may enclose this paper, which perhaps may make the breach incurable. If it does, so much the better, for he'll have the less trouble afterward.
So this is very typical advice. If you want to break off a relationship, do it in writing, not in person, and perhaps share their response with this person in print.
A young man of a very amorous disposition has had the misfortune to yield to every attack of his passion. He has promised 2 young gentlewomen marriage and therefore enjoyed them both. This heat of imprudent love being over, he is very sensible of his fault and very melancholy upon it. His inclinations do not lend him to have either of these, nor can he see any way to make her or them a satisfactory restitution. I humbly beg your speedy answer.
First, let him heartily beg pardon of God Almighty and continue the same every day he lives. Then, unless there be any private reason, or rather necessity, why he should marry one more than the other, and there can be but one, which he may easily guess, we think he ought to marry neither. If they both live and refuse to release him, he must remain single all his life, since he cannot lawfully marry either of them or any other.
So in this case, he can't marry either one, having seduced them both, unless one became pregnant, which they obliquely suggest, but obviously. Okay, next we have a woman who resisted seduction. And did that help?
I am a young woman who has been courted by several very good gentlemen, but I never could love any of them. Then it was my hard fortune to be courted by a master of a ship, and I loved him as dearly as my life. When he knew I loved him, he would have lain with me, but as dearly as I loved him, I kept myself honest. He saw that he could not make a whore of me, told me he loved me for my virtue, and did it only to try me. So I could not hate him. All this was against my friends' consent, so that they turned me out of their doors because I loved him. Then he promised to marry me, and I lent him money. The night before we were to be married, he went away, and I have not seen him since. Pray, be pleased to advise me what to do. Had I best marry another, or live a maid all my lifetime, or send letters to him, kind words or cross words for revenge? He has not sent one word since he went away, and my heart is almost broken. Your speedy answer is desired.
Once a year we meet with such innocence, and when we do, we inform the world of it. By entertaining a faithless sailor against your friend's consent, you behave badly, and might have been more severely punished than you have been. It's good you came off as well as you did, and that your love and innocence together have not quite ruined you. We believe you escaped well, with the loss of a little money when he left you your virtue, which was much more valuable. Now, to answer your questions, admit some other more virtuous and deserving lover, if any such offers, which will be the best way to put the traitor out of your memory. As for letters to him, Never trouble yourself, since either he'll not answer them at all, or else wheedle you again, make 1,000 excuses, which we men never lack, and 10 to 1 persuade you to believe him and give him all that he left behind. Or if he should marry you, he might have 2 or 3 wives in other ports, who must all be served before you.
So again, we get from the Athenians a negative view of men, especially of shipmasters. And this is not the only time that they make negative comments about sailors. And then finally, there's a wife dealing with an abusive husband.
Has a husband who treats her barbarously, placing her in danger of her life. He keeps a whore, refusing to live with his wife, but making her work for her bread. She has the offer of a single gentleman that will maintain her very well. Query, is it any sin to accept his kindness?
If the words will maintain signify keeping in the usual sense of it, the case is clear. And why all this fine, clean language to wrap up that broad word whore, with which she so fairly brands one that is kept by her husband, when about to place herself in the same circumstances? Is there any reason why a woman ought to turn whore because her husband is a whoremaster? It is much more honorable and honest to get her living by painful labor, nay, almost by begging itself.
So to an abused wife, they offer little hope, and she is not the only one who received such answers from them. And with that, I will end this part of the program. And I want to thank my assistants up here who did it. I'm sure you all agree, did a great job reading the letters and answers. And now I'm happy to answer any questions from people here or on Zoom.
We have time for a couple questions.
Thank you to all of you. Mary Beth, I had 2 questions. One is, in doing this project, what surprised you the most in reading this material? And the second one was, why did you decide to do a non-academic book?
Okay, all right. First question. What surprised me the most was how witty the answers often were and how good they often were. I have to say that when I first started, I was mostly interested in the questions, and the more I worked on it, the more I got interested in the answers. So that's it. And why did I decide to do a non-academic book? With no footnotes, I might add. This is the only book I've ever written in my life without any footnotes. Actually, there is one footnote which explains why there are no footnotes, but basically, I wanted to do something really different. This was my pandemic project. It turned out to be that, and I was supposed to be doing something else, and because of the pandemic, what I was supposed to be doing got canceled. It was preparing a lecture that was going to be given at a conference, and the conference was canceled, and so there was no point in working on that lecture anymore. And I had these letters and answers from the Athenian Mercury in the back of my mind for a number of years since I first encountered them. I mentioned that I read this book by Helen Berry, and that was when I was researching my book called Separated by Their Sex, which has published by the Cornell Press in 2011. And so I just thought, why don't I work on these letters and answers, because they were so fascinating, and that's how I did it. It was really fun doing a non-academic book, and people do seem to have really enjoyed it so far.
I just had a question about whether or not you saw with the Athenians their questions and answers, if there are any
Sorry,
about
I can hardly hear what
Sorry.
you're saying.
right here. Okay. I was just wondering if while you were researching this and looking at the Athenian questions and answers, if you saw any from same-sex, about same-sex relationships.
There is only one question that is about a same-sex situation. One questioner says, is it possible for a woman to love another woman as passionately as a man? And they say, they give a kind of an ambiguous answer, and they say sort of maybe. Or it's possible to love, but not as passionately, not in a sexual, passionate way, is what they say. That's the only one about same-sex relationships that they published. Maybe it's the only, I don't know if it's the only question they ever got, but it's the one they published.
This is, hi, this is wonderful, but you left out the, purposefully, you left out the other kinds of questions.
Yeah,
And I'm very interested in what people might have thought about an answer to a question like, does the sun revolve around
Right,
the earth?
right.
The earth? In the United States now, we have 25% of the population think, this is seriously
Yeah.
true. It's about India does a little better, Europe
Yeah.
a little worse,
Yeah.
but the United States, a fourth of us, we believe things that in the 15th century would have had burned at a stake or
Right.
something like that, right? I'm curious, did you find anything interesting in the non-love sections of the queries?
Well, that would have been a different book. And I wasn't interested in writing that book. I think it would be an interesting book for someone to write, to think about what the nature of the questions were and the nature of the answers overall. But, and there are people who've done history of science who are interested in that, I have discovered. But as I said, it's not something that interested me. And in fact, when I could, I skipped over those questions. I told you that when I was able to look at the bound volumes, there were indexes that led me to the topics of the questions I was interested in. So I just didn't even pay attention to the other questions. When I did not have the bound volumes available to me and I was skimming through questions and answers, I literally skimmed right past anything that wasn't about love, sex, or marriage. So over to you.
Okay, well, we've gotten to a little beyond 11:30. And Mary Beth, we would like to thank you so much for a very wonderful
Thank you.